All right, welcome everyone. Today we're diving deep into one of history's biggest tragedies, the Partition of India.
Huge.
Yeah, we've got a ton of sources to dig through here to figure out how and why this happened and why it still matters.
Absolutely.
You know, we're talking about the largest mass migration in human history here.
Yeah, the numbers are just staggering. 14 million people.
14 million people displaced. It's hard to even wrap your head around that.
It really is. And it happened right as the British were leaving India.
Yeah.
After 200 years of colonial rule.
You'd think it would be a time for, like, celebration and liberation.
Exactly. A moment of incredible hope. But instead, the subcontinent was divided.
Into India and Pakistan.
Right. And that division led to just utter chaos.
It's crazy how quickly things went downhill. Some of the sources here talk about, like, trains arriving full of corpses.
Yeah. Chilling stuff.
And rivers literally running red with blood.
Yeah, the human cost is almost impossible to grasp. At least 1 million people were killed.
1 million people? And that number doesn't even begin to capture the true suffering, you know?
No, it doesn't. We're talking about families ripped apart, neighbors turning on each other.
And the sources really bring that home with, like, all the personal stories.
Right.
And the accounts from women who faced just horrific atrocities during this time.
Yeah, that's something that really stands out in the sources.
Really underscores the personal and intimate nature of this tragedy.
It does, and it ties into this concept of invisible borders that we'll talk about more throughout our deep dive.
Invisible borders.
Yeah, so the physical borders drawn during partition, obviously those created a ton of upheaval.
Right.
But then there were these psychological divisions, the distrust, the fear. Those became invisible borders that really persisted long after 1947.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. The British just decided to leave and, like, boom, instant chaos. Or was there more to it?
It wasn't that simple. There was a lot leading up to it. To really understand how things got so bad, we need to look at the role of British colonialism.
Okay, so how did they contribute to this mess?
Well, for decades, they implemented this strategy of divide and rule.
Divide and rule.
Yeah, they were very intentional about pitting different groups against each other.
Like how?
Well, one way was by allocating jobs and resources based on religious identity.
So they were actually using religious identity as a tool for control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it backfired spectacularly. By the early 20th century, you start to see these divisions manifesting in two distinct nationalist movements.
Okay.
So you have the Indian National Congress with leaders like Gandhi and Nehru.
Right.
They were advocating for a unified India.
Gandhi, the champion of nonviolence and unity. It's hard to imagine him in the midst of all this chaos.
It is. But at the same time, you have the Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and they were pushing for a separate Muslim state.
So two very different visions for the future of the subcontinent.
Right. And the Muslim League was really concerned about being marginalized in a Hindu-majority independent India.
That makes sense.
They even boycotted the Constituent Assembly that was supposed to be drafting India's constitution.
Wow. So tensions were already running high.
Extremely high. And then you have the communal riots of 1946, particularly the ones in Calcutta and Noakhali.
Those were brutal.
Thousands were killed. And it really exposed the deep-seated animosity that was bubbling beneath the surface.
The sources really paint a vivid picture of those riots. It's pretty chilling stuff.
It is. But even with all that, the scale of what happened next is still almost unimaginable.
It's hard to believe it could get even worse.
And what's even crazier is how the borders themselves were drawn. This is where Cyril Radcliffe comes in.
Who's that?
He was a British lawyer. And get this, he'd never even been to India before.
Wait, you're telling me that the fate of millions of people was decided by someone who had never even set foot in the country?
It's true. They tasked him with drawing the borders between India and Pakistan.
In like a week.
5 weeks.
5 weeks.
And he was relying on outdated maps and census data.
Talk about a recipe for disaster.
It was. Yeah, and to make matters worse, he was working with incomplete information. The 1941 census was never even fully tabulated.
Why not?
World War II.
Oh, right.
So you've got this guy, Radcliffe, trying to carve up a subcontinent with like half the data he needs.
And no real understanding of the people living there?
None whatsoever.
Yeah.
He didn't grasp the complex cultural and religious landscape at all.
So he's basically just drawing lines on a map.
Pretty much.
Oblivious to the lives and communities he's splitting apart.
Yeah, and the results were just disastrous cities like Lahore and Amritsar.
I've heard of those.
Yeah, they had these vibrant mixed populations, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, all living together.
Right.
And then suddenly they're brutally divided. Imagine waking up one morning and finding yourself on the wrong side of the border.
Everything you know is suddenly in a different country.
Exactly. Your
Yeah.
home, your livelihood, your community, it's all gone.
It's heartbreaking. The sources talk about the utter chaos that followed.
Oh yeah, it was a complete nightmare. People desperately trying to reach the other side.
Before the borders closed.
Right, and it wasn't just about the lines on a map. It was the human cost of those decisions.
The families separated, the businesses disrupted, the entire fabric of society torn apart.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, the British executed the whole thing with such callous haste.
It's like they set a fire and then just walked away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Leaving millions to deal with the flames.
It seems like such a colossal failure of leadership.
It was. They abandoned a region they had exploited for centuries and just didn't seem to care about the consequences.
Some of the sources even suggest that certain British officials actually profited from the chaos.
Yeah, it's a pretty dark chapter in history, and the effects are still being felt today.
Right, we talked about those invisible borders earlier.
Yeah, the psychological divisions, the distrust, the fear.
Those are still haunting the region.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the most stark examples of this is the ongoing conflict over Kashmir.
Kashmir, the jewel in the crown, as they called it.
Right, both India and Pakistan claimed it, and it became this flashpoint.
Can you walk us through how that happened?
Sure. So the Maharaja of Kashmir at the time, Hari Singh, was a Hindu ruler,
Okay.
but he ruled a Muslim-majority state.
Interesting.
He initially wanted to remain independent, but then tribal militias backed by Pakistan invaded.
So he had to choose sides.
He did, and he ultimately chose to accede to India.
And that sparked the first Indo-Pak War in 1947.
It did, and since then there have been 2 more wars and countless skirmishes over Kashmir.
Making it one of the most militarized zones in the world.
It's a tragedy for everyone involved.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how the legacy of partition continues to shape the region.
Not just the political landscape, but also the lives of ordinary people.
Absolutely. And Kashmir is just one example. These invisible borders also manifest in other ways.
Like how?
Well, look at how religious identities continue to be politicized in both India and Pakistan.
You mean how politicians use those old wounds for their own gain?
Exactly. We see it in the rise of Hindu nationalism in India,
Right.
with this narrative that Muslims are somehow less Indian.
It's like those old divisions are being exploited all over again.
They are. And we see it in Pakistan, too, where minority groups like Ahmadis and Christians face discrimination and violence.
So the ghost of partition is still very much alive.
It is casting a long shadow over the region. And it's not just limited to South Asia either.
Right. This event had ripple effects that reached the South Asian diaspora worldwide.
Absolutely. Think about the millions who were forced to flee their homes during partition.
They carried those stories with them.
They did stories of trauma loss and displacement passed down through generations.
So the trauma of partition becomes part of their family history.
Exactly, shaping their identity and their sense of belonging. It's almost like an invisible inheritance.
Wow, I never thought about it that way.
It's powerful stuff. Many descendants of partition survivors grew up hearing these fragmented stories about harrowing journeys, lost homes, and loved ones left behind.
It must be hard to carry that weight.
It is. But there's also this incredible resilience that comes with it, this determination to build a new life.
It makes you wonder what we can learn from all this. You know, why should we care about an event that happened almost 80 years ago?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is multi-layered. First and foremost, the partition is a chillingly relevant cautionary tale for our own time.
How so?
Well, we're seeing the rise of nationalism and sectarianism all over the world, leaders using the same kind of divisive rhetoric that fueled the violence in 1947.
It's like we're watching those same patterns play out again.
Exactly. And it's frightening. We need to recognize the warning signs, those appeals to fear and hatred that can so easily turn neighbors into enemies.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. You know, it's easy to get caught up in the sheer scale of the tragedy here, the political stuff, the lasting consequences.
Right.
But I'm also struck by all these stories of resilience and kindness in the midst of all the chaos.
Absolutely. Even in the darkest moments of partition, there were countless acts of courage, compassion, and just incredible defiance against this tide of hatred.
Like what?
Well, there are stories of Hindus sheltering Muslims, Sikhs protecting Hindus people, risking their own lives to help others, regardless of their religion.
It's amazing how, in the midst of all that horror, people could still hold on to their humanity.
It really is inspiring.
Yeah.
You know, even when everything around them is falling apart, these individuals chose to see the person in front of them.
Not the label.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those choices, those acts of kindness, they weren't just isolated incidents. They represent something deeper.
What do you mean?
I think it shows that even amidst unimaginable suffering, our capacity for empathy and compassion can still come through.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
Are there any specific stories from the sources that really illustrate this?
There are so many, but one that sticks with me is the story of this Sikh man who saved hundreds of Muslim families.
How?
He drove them through dangerous territory to safety. He faced threats and violence along the way, but he refused to abandon those in need.
Wow, just one person making a huge difference.
No, it's incredible, right? It shows that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person can still make a difference.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
No, not at all. These stories give us hope. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, humanity can still shine through.
It makes you wonder what we would do in a similar situation.
It does.
Wow.
Would we have the courage to stand up for what's right, to protect the vulnerable, even if it meant putting ourselves at risk?
Tough questions. It brings us back to something we talked about at the beginning. Why does the partition of India still matter today? What can we learn from this all these years later?
Well, on a very basic level, it reminds us of the human cost of division and hatred.
Right.
It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked nationalism, the fragility of peace, and it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
About our capacity for both incredible cruelty and incredible compassion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a mirror reflecting back our potential for both good and evil. It challenges us to choose wisely, to learn from the mistakes of the past.
And build a better future.
Exactly. It's not just about remembering the tragedy, but about learning from it and applying those lessons to the challenges we face today.
So how do we do that?
Well, for starters, we need to recognize the warning signs, the divisive rhetoric, the demonization of the other. And we have to actively work to counter those narratives.
It's like we have to be more vigilant.
We do. We need to promote empathy, understanding, and dialogue across divides. And remember that ultimately our destinies are interconnected, whether we like it or not.
It's a powerful message. So the partition isn't just a historical event.
No, it's a call to action.
A challenge for all of us to be more aware, more compassionate, more engaged in building a more just and peaceful world.
Exactly. And maybe that's the most enduring legacy of the partition. Not the violence or the division, but the lessons we can learn. The hope we can glean from the darkness. It's up to us to carry those lessons forward.
And create a future worthy of the sacrifices made by those who lived through this tragedy.
A future where those millions of displaced souls, those families torn apart, those lives lost, are not forgotten, but serve as a reminder.
A reminder of what we must never allow to happen again.
Exactly. We must always strive for understanding, empathy, unity, peace. Because the story of the partition isn't just about what happened in 1947. It's about how we choose to remember it, how we choose to learn from it, and how we choose to shape the future.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but we've only just scratched the surface.
There's always more to learn.
We encourage you to keep exploring this topic, to dig deeper into the stories, the complexities, the legacies of this event. And as you do consider this,
could something like the partition happen again, somewhere else in the world, maybe even in our own time? And if so, what can we do individually and collectively to prevent it?
Those are questions worth thinking about, talking about, and most importantly, acting upon.
Because history has a way of repeating itself if we don't learn from its lessons.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better future.